Welcome to Truth Behind History, where we uncover the hidden events that shaped the modern world. Today, we're diving into a moment in American financial history so secretive that its participants went to extreme lengths to keep it under wraps. This is the story of the Jekyll Island meeting of 1910, a covert gathering that laid the foundation for the Federal Reserve, the central banking system of the United States. So, what exactly happened on Jekyll Island? Let's set the scene. In November 1910, 6 of the most powerful men in American finance and politics boarded a private train from New Jersey, their identities concealed under fake names. Their destination? Jekyll Island, an exclusive retreat off the coast of Georgia. These men weren't just any bankers or politicians, they were the architects of America's financial future. Among them were Senator Nelson Aldrich, Paul Warburg, and top banking executives from J.P. Morgan and Company. And why the secrecy? Well, imagine if the public found out that a handful of elite bankers were secretly designing a new financial system that would give them immense power over the economy. Yeah, that probably wouldn't have gone over too well. The fear was that if the public knew what they were planning, there would be massive opposition. Their objective was clear: to create a centralized banking system that could prevent financial crises like the ones that had repeatedly thrown the American economy into chaos. They wanted a system that would stabilize the economy, control inflation, and ensure that major banks had the power to act quickly in times of financial panic. But was this truly about stability, or was it about securing control over America's money supply? That's the question historians still debate today. This secret meeting would ultimately lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, changing the financial landscape of the United States forever. But who exactly were the key players behind this historic event? Let's take a closer look. To understand the significance of the Jekyll Island meeting, we need to examine the key figures who orchestrated it. These men weren't just powerful, they were the architects of modern American banking. Each of them played a crucial role in shaping what would eventually become the Federal Reserve System. First, we have Senator Nelson Aldrich. If you've never heard of him, think of him as one of the most influential politicians in American finance at the time. As the leader of the National Monetary Commission, Aldrich was responsible for studying global banking systems and proposing solutions to America's financial instability. He was a strong advocate for banking reform, and his connections to Wall Street were no secret. His daughter even married into the Rockefeller family. Talk about keeping money in the family. Then, there's Paul Warburg, the European banking expert. If anyone at the meeting truly understood the concept of a central bank, it was him. Warburg came from a German banking dynasty and was heavily influenced by the European financial model, where central banks had long existed. He believed the United States needed something similar, a structured, centralized institution that could control the money supply and prevent financial collapses. Warburg was a strong believer that the banking system should not be left to individual, competing banks but should be coordinated on a national level. And finally, Henry P. Davison, a partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, represented the interests of major financial institutions. He was there to ensure that whatever system was created, the powerful private banks, especially those tied to J.P. Morgan, would not lose their influence over financial markets. Davison understood that a central banking system could serve the interests of both the government and private banking elites if structured correctly. These 3 men, along with their associates, had one goal: to draft a new financial structure that would prevent economic collapses while ensuring the major banks maintained control over monetary policy. But what they proposed wasn't just a minor reform, it was a complete restructuring of the U.S. financial system. And by the time they left Jekyll Island, they had developed a framework that would soon lead to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. But how exactly did their secret plan become law? Let's find out. By the time the Jekyll Island meeting ended, these financial powerhouses had crafted the blueprint for what would soon become the Federal Reserve System. But a secret plan means nothing if it doesn't turn into action. Over the next few years, the ideas from Jekyll Island were carefully introduced into political discussions, slowly making their way toward becoming law. On December 23, 1913, under President Woodrow Wilson, the Federal Reserve Act was officially signed into law. And just like that, the United States had a central banking system for the first time since the early 1800s. But this wasn't just about creating a new institution, it was about fundamentally reshaping the American financial landscape. So, what did the Federal Reserve Act actually do? First, it established 12 regional Federal Reserve banks across the country. These were meant to decentralize the banking system, ensuring that no single institution had total control. On paper, this made it seem like power was spread out, but in reality, these regional banks were still highly interconnected and worked under a centralized policy framework. Next, the law introduced regulated monetary policy, which gave the Federal Reserve the ability to control inflation, manage liquidity, and respond to financial instability. This was a massive shift in economic power. Before this, banking crises were handled in a much more chaotic, unregulated way, often leaving the economy in shambles. Now, the Federal Reserve had the authority to influence the economy by adjusting interest rates and controlling the money supply. At the time, this was seen as a safeguard, a way to prevent economic downturns and keep the financial system stable. But with great power comes great responsibility, and as we'll see, the Federal Reserve's role in the economy would only grow more complex and controversial over the coming decades. But how exactly does the Federal Reserve work, and what role does it play in today's economy? Let's break it down. Now that we know how the Federal Reserve was created, let's talk about how it actually works. Because, let's be honest, the Fed isn't exactly the easiest thing to understand. It operates behind the scenes, influencing everything from interest rates to inflation, but most people don't really know how it functions on a day-to-day basis. So, let's break it down. The Federal Reserve has three main responsibilities that keep the financial system running. First, there's monetary policy control. This means the Fed has the power to adjust interest rates and control the money supply to keep the economy stable. Think of it as a thermostat for the economy. When inflation gets too high, the Fed can raise interest rates to slow things down. When the economy is struggling, the Fed can lower interest rates to encourage borrowing and spending. These adjustments might seem small, but they have huge consequences for businesses, consumers, and the stock market. Next, we have the regulation of banks. The Federal Reserve isn't just about setting interest rates, it also oversees commercial banks to ensure they're following financial regulations and not taking reckless risks. This is supposed to prevent another financial disaster like the one seen in the past. But, as history has shown, regulation doesn't always mean prevention. And finally, there's the lender of last resort function. This is where the Federal Reserve steps in during financial crises to provide emergency liquidity to banks that are on the verge of collapse. If you've ever heard about banks getting bailed out, this is where that power comes from. When a bank is failing and there's no one left to save it, the Fed can step in with emergency funds to prevent a domino effect that could crash the entire economy. So, in theory, the Federal Reserve exists to stabilize the financial system and protect the economy from chaos. But as we'll see, its actions haven't always been met with applause. Sometimes, the Fed's decisions have had huge unintended consequences, some of which have led to economic disasters. And speaking of financial disasters, let's look at how the Federal Reserve has responded to some of the biggest economic crises in American history. The Federal Reserve was created to prevent financial crises, but history has shown that economic disasters are often inevitable. What really matters is how the Fed responds when things start to fall apart. Over the past century, the Federal Reserve has played a key role in managing some of the biggest financial crises in American history. Let's look at a few major case studies. First, we have the Great Depression of 1929. This was the worst economic collapse in U.S. history, and many economists argue that the Federal Reserve failed spectacularly in its response. When the stock market crashed, banks started failing at an alarming rate, wiping out people's life savings overnight. Instead of stepping in to inject money into the economy and prevent bank collapses, the Fed hesitated, allowing deflation to spiral out of control. The result? Unemployment skyrocketed, businesses collapsed, and the U.S. economy suffered for an entire decade. It wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt's policies, and eventually World War II, that the economy fully recovered. Then, there was the 2008 financial crisis, a crisis triggered by risky banking practices, subprime mortgages, and an overinflated housing market. This time, the Federal Reserve took a much more aggressive approach. They introduced quantitative easing, a policy where the Fed injected massive amounts of money into the economy by purchasing financial assets. They also bailed out major banks and corporations, preventing a total economic meltdown. But while this prevented the crisis from getting worse, it also sparked a debate: was the Fed simply saving reckless bankers while leaving ordinary people to struggle? And most recently, the COVID-19 economic response in 2020. When the pandemic shut down businesses overnight, the Federal Reserve acted fast, slashing interest rates to nearly zero and launching massive stimulus programs. Trillions of dollars were pumped into the economy to keep businesses and households afloat. But this rapid expansion of money supply came at a cost. It contributed to historic inflation levels that we're still dealing with today. These crises show that the Federal Reserve has enormous power to shape the economy during times of uncertainty. But every decision it makes has long-term consequences. Some argue that without the Fed's intervention, financial crises would be even worse. Others believe that the Fed's actions have created new problems, such as inflation and excessive government debt. And this brings us to the big question: is the Federal Reserve truly acting in the public's best interest, or is it serving the financial elites who helped create it? Let's dive into the controversies surrounding the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve may have been created to stabilize the economy, but not everyone is convinced that it always acts in the best interests of the American people. In fact, the Fed has been at the center of major controversies for over a century. Some see it as a necessary institution that keeps the economy from collapsing, while others argue that it operates with too much power and too little accountability. Let's break down 3 of the biggest criticisms of the Federal Reserve. First, lack of public oversight. Unlike most government agencies, the Federal Reserve operates independently, meaning it doesn't answer directly to Congress or the President in the same way other institutions do. This independence was intended to keep politics out of monetary policy, but it also raises serious concerns about transparency. Who is really making the decisions that affect inflation, interest rates, and the money supply? And how do we know those decisions are in the best interest of the people rather than powerful financial institutions? Next, we have the influence of private bankers. Critics argue that the Federal Reserve is too closely tied to Wall Street. Remember, the Fed was designed with input from elite bankers, and its leadership often comes from the very financial institutions it's supposed to regulate. This has led to accusations that the Fed caters to big banks while everyday Americans are left to deal with the consequences. For example, during financial crises, we've seen massive bailouts for large corporations while ordinary people struggled with unemployment and rising costs of living. And finally, there's the impact on inflation. Some economists argue that the Fed's policies, especially its willingness to print money and keep interest rates low, fuel inflation and create financial bubbles. When the Fed injects massive amounts of money into the economy, it can temporarily stimulate growth, but it also devalues the currency, leading to rising prices. We saw this after the COVID-19 stimulus measures, which helped avoid an immediate recession but also contributed to record-high inflation that made everyday essentials much more expensive. At the core of these debates is one fundamental question: does the Federal Reserve have too much power over the economy? Some argue that we need the Fed to prevent financial disasters, while others believe that its interventions often create even bigger problems down the road. Despite these criticisms, the Federal Reserve isn't going anywhere. So, how does it function in today's economy, and what role does it continue to play? Let's take a look. Love it or hate it, the Federal Reserve remains one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world. Over the years, its role has expanded far beyond what the original creators at Jekyll Island envisioned. Today, the Federal Reserve isn't just a banking system, it's a central force in shaping the entire US economy. So, what exactly does the Federal Reserve do in the modern world? Let's break it down into 3 key responsibilities. First, there's monetary policy management. This is the Fed's most well-known role, controlling inflation and adjusting interest rates to keep the economy stable. When inflation is high, the Fed raises interest rates to slow down spending and borrowing. When the economy is struggling, it lowers interest rates to encourage growth. These decisions affect everything from mortgage rates to credit card debt to the stock market. In short, when the Fed acts, you feel it in your wallet. Next, we have crisis response. Every time the economy hits a major roadblock, whether it's a banking collapse, a stock market crash, or a global pandemic, the Federal Reserve steps in. It does this by injecting money into the economy, bailing out financial institutions, and using tools like quantitative easing to keep markets stable. This is why, when there's an economic meltdown, all eyes turn to the Fed to see what it's going to do next. And finally, there's regulation of financial institutions. In theory, the Federal Reserve is supposed to act as a watchdog, making sure that banks play by the rules and don't take reckless risks. It enforces laws designed to prevent fraud, protect consumers, and keep financial markets running smoothly. But as we've seen, many critics argue that the Fed is too lenient on big banks and that its regulatory efforts don't go far enough. So, the Federal Reserve today is more than just a bank, it's an economic powerhouse with global influence. But the debate over its power, transparency, and effectiveness continues. Which brings us to our final question: what has been the lasting impact of the Federal Reserve? Let's wrap it up. You said? So, what's the final verdict on the Federal Reserve? Has it been a force for stability, or has it given too much power to a select few? There's no denying that the creation of the Federal Reserve reshaped US monetary policy. Before its establishment, financial crises were frequent and chaotic, with no clear system in place to manage them. Since 1913, the Fed has played a central role in regulating the economy, attempting to balance growth, inflation, and financial stability. Without it, some argue, the US economy would have suffered even worse collapses. But at the same time, the Fed has always been surrounded by controversy. Critics argue that while it prevents some crises, it creates others. Whether it's the Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis, or the inflation crisis of recent years, many believe that the Federal Reserve's actions have sometimes made economic problems worse rather than solving them. The debate over transparency and influence is still ongoing, and whether or not the Fed truly acts in the public's best interest is a question that remains unanswered. One thing is for sure, the Federal Reserve isn't going anywhere. It continues to adapt to modern economic challenges, using its power to shape financial markets, regulate banks, and influence the money supply. Whether you see it as a necessary institution or a tool of financial elites, its impact on our daily lives is undeniable. If you found this video interesting, make sure to subscribe to Truth Behind History for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Do you think the Federal Reserve is a necessary force for stability, or do you think it has too much power? Let me know in the comments. And if you love history, check out my other videos. You never know what hidden truths you'll uncover. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.